The road stretched endlessly beneath the burning sun, a ribbon of shimmering heat that seemed to melt into the horizon. The land was quiet except for the whisper of the wind that rolled through the tall golden grass. It was one of those summer afternoons when the world felt heavy and still, when even the birds were silent, hiding from the heat. Elena walked along that lonely road with her baby held close to her chest, her bare feet pressed against the hot ground, every step sending a sharp sting through her soles. She had lost her shoes somewhere behind her, but she didn't turn back. There was no time for that. The baby, only a few months old, slept in her arms, his tiny face pressed against her shoulder. The sun painted her skin a deep bronze, and beads of sweat rolled down her forehead, sliding into her tired eyes. She blinked them away and kept walking. Her cotton dress clung to her from the sweat and dust. It had once been pale blue, but now it was faded and stained from the journey. The small diaper bag slung across her shoulder grew heavier with each passing mile, though it held only a half-full bottle of milk, a thin blanket, and a folded photograph. She carried that picture not because she wanted to look at it, but because it reminded her of what she needed to leave behind, and what she wanted to find ahead. The world around her was silent, except for the soft coo of her baby and the distant hum of insects. Every now and then a truck passed by, leaving behind a gust of wind and a cloud of dust. Most drivers didn't slow down. Some didn't even notice her. Others glanced once, perhaps thinking she was someone just out for a walk, though there was nothing but miles of empty road in every direction. But Elena didn't blame them. People had their own troubles, their own lives to worry about. She had learned long ago that help didn't always come when you wanted it, and sometimes it didn't come at all. Still, a small part of her hoped that maybe, just maybe, someone would stop. The baby stirred in her arms, letting out a soft cry. She stopped walking, rocking him gently. "Shh, it's okay," she whispered in a hoarse voice. Her throat was dry, her lips cracked from thirst. She took the bottle from her bag, but the milk inside had grown warm under the sun. The baby drank a little before turning his head away, frowning. Elena sighed softly and kissed his forehead. "We'll find water soon," she said, more to herself than to him. She looked around. The road stretched between wide fields of yellow grass, broken here and there by old fences and distant trees. Far in the distance, she thought she could see a roof, maybe a barn, maybe a small house. Her heart gave a little leap. If she could just make it there, maybe someone would let her rest in the shade, give her a drink of water, or even a place to sit down, so she kept walking. The hours passed slowly, and the sun moved across the sky like a burning, watchful eye. Each shadow she passed seemed to vanish before she could rest in it. Her feet were red and swollen now, the skin tender and scratched by gravel, but she didn't complain. She didn't even let herself cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry anymore, not in front of her baby. He was all she had now, and he needed to see strength in her even if she didn't feel it inside. As she walked, her thoughts drifted to the road behind her. She remembered the morning she had left. It had been quiet just before dawn when the air was still cool and the world felt forgiving. She had looked around her small room one last time, picked up her baby and whispered a prayer. Not a loud one, not a long one, just a few words asking for safety and courage. Then she stepped outside and didn't look back. That was hours ago. Maybe days. Time had started to blur together. The baby began to cry again, softly at first, then louder. Elena tried to hum a song she remembered from her childhood, something her mother used to sing while cooking dinner in the evenings. Her voice cracked on the first few notes, but she kept singing, even when the sound was little more than a whisper. Slowly, the baby's cries turned into hiccups, and finally, he drifted back to sleep. Elena's shoulders ached. Her arms trembled from holding the baby for so long, but she refused to let go. She imagined what the baby might think years from now when he was old enough to understand this journey, if he would ever understand it. She hoped he would see it not as a time of struggle, but as the moment everything changed for the better. A faint breeze brushed against her skin. It was warm, but even that small movement of air felt like a gift. She closed her eyes for a moment and let it wash over her. When she opened them again, she saw a hawk circling high above, gliding effortlessly in the sky. For a moment, she envied its freedom. The bird didn't have to walk or worry. It just soared where it pleased. Her legs felt heavy, her knees weak. She stopped walking and looked behind her. The road was empty, a ribbon of silence stretching back to nowhere. Ahead, the distant shape of the roof still shimmered in the heat, closer now, but still far. She tightened her grip on the baby and whispered, "We're almost there, sweetheart. Just a little more." And she started forward again. By now, the shadows were longer. The sun had begun to dip slightly toward the west, and the world was tinted gold. The light was beautiful in its own lonely way, casting long patterns across the grass and glinting off the edges of the road. But beauty meant little when your body ached and your stomach was empty. Still, Elena found comfort in small things. The rhythm of her steps, the sound of the wind brushing through the weeds, the way her baby's tiny fingers clutched her dress even in sleep. For a brief moment, she thought she heard the low hum of an engine behind her. She turned, squinting through the haze. Far back on the road, a truck was coming, slow and steady, dust rising in its wake. Her heart raced. She didn't know whether to wave or not. She wanted help, yes, but she was also afraid. The world could be kind, but it could also be cruel, and she didn't know which kind of person might be driving that truck. So she waited. The truck grew closer and she stepped a little off the road, clutching her baby tightly. Her hair, long and tangled from the wind, fell across her face. The truck rumbled past her without slowing down, the driver glancing her way for just a second before continuing down the road. The moment passed as quickly as it came. The dust settled. The silence returned. Elena took a deep breath, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and began walking again. Somehow, despite everything, she found the strength to smile. "We're okay," she whispered softly to her baby. "We'll get there soon." As she walked, she thought about all the things she wanted for her child. A place to sleep safely, a small garden where he could play, maybe a kind neighbor or two who smiled when they passed by. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The baby stirred again and opened his eyes, looking up at her with soft curiosity. She smiled down at him. "You're my little hero," she said. "We're doing this together." In the distance, the roof she had seen all day finally began to take shape, a weathered barn next to a small white house surrounded by fences. Her heart filled with cautious hope. Maybe someone lived there. Maybe they would open their door. Maybe there would be water. She didn't know it yet, but someone was indeed there. A man who hadn't had a visitor in years, a man who had long stopped believing in miracles, and before the sun would set, their paths would cross, two lives from completely different worlds, meeting on a road that neither of them had expected to travel that day. But for now, there was only the sound of her footsteps on the hot road, the soft breathing of her baby, and the endless sky above them, wide, bright, and waiting. The sun hung high over the wide Texas plains, shining down on miles of open land that stretched as far as the eye could see. The air shimmered with heat, rising like waves from the ground. Out here in the middle of nowhere, time seemed to move slower. The fields whispered softly when the wind passed, and the sky, endless and bright, looked like a giant blue ocean without water. Thomas Grady sat on the edge of his wooden porch watching the dust swirl in the yard. The boards beneath him creaked when he shifted his weight. His ranch was quiet except for the low hum of insects and the distant call of a crow. He had lived here for more than 30 years, and for the last 10, he had lived here alone. A tall man with sunburned skin and tired eyes, Thomas had once been full of laughter and energy. In his younger days, he could ride for hours, fix fences until the stars came out, and still have the strength to sing by the fire. But now at 58, the days all felt the same. Mornings started with coffee and ended with silence. The cows didn't talk back, and the radio had stopped working months ago. His wife, Mary, had been the heart of the place. She loved the land more than he did. She used to fill the porch with flowers and hum while hanging laundry on the line. But after she passed, everything changed. The ranch still stood strong and proud, but it had lost its warmth. Thomas wiped his forehead with a folded bandana and took a sip of water from a tin cup. The taste of dust clung to his tongue. He leaned back in his chair, staring across the wide field toward the road that ran along the edge of his property. It was a long, empty road. Most days he saw no one. Maybe a delivery truck once a week. Maybe a neighbor driving to town every few days. But today, something felt different. He didn't know why, but there was a strange stillness in the air, like the world was waiting for something. Thomas stood up, stretching his back. The wooden boards creaked under his boots as he walked to his truck. The old blue pickup had faded paint and a dented fender, but it still ran well enough. He had planned to drive into town to pick up feed and some mail. It wasn't a long trip, but he looked forward to it. It was his one small connection to the world beyond his ranch. He climbed in, turned the key, and the engine sputtered before roaring to life. He tapped the dashboard. "Good girl," he muttered with a small smile. As he drove down the dusty road, the warm wind whipped through the open window. The smell of dry earth and wild sage filled the air. He passed the familiar landmarks, the old windmill that hadn't worked in years, the wooden sign that used to read Grady Ranch but now leaned crookedly to one side, and the field where he once planted corn before giving up on farming altogether. He thought about his children, both grown, both living in cities far away. They called sometimes, sent cards on holidays, and promised to visit soon. But soon never came. He didn't blame them. Life had a way of pulling people in different directions. As the truck rolled along, Thomas's mind drifted. He thought about Mary again, about her laughter, her voice, the way she used to scold him for leaving his boots in the hallway. Even after all these years, he could still hear her words when the house got too quiet. Sometimes he would talk back just to fill the silence. A few miles down the road, the heat shimmered more intensely. The sunlight blurred the air ahead, and something small and dark appeared in the distance. Thomas squinted. At first he thought it was just a shadow, maybe a stray cow near the fence line. But as he got closer, the shape became clearer. Someone was walking. He slowed down a little, his brow furrowing. It wasn't common to see people on foot out here, not in this kind of weather. As he got nearer, he realized it was a woman. She was carrying something, no, someone. A baby. Thomas's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing against the glare. The woman was barefoot, her steps slow and careful. Her dress fluttered weakly in the hot wind, and her hair clung to her face. She looked exhausted, like she had been walking for miles. He passed her at first, driving slowly, the sound of his truck echoing in the emptiness. His heart gave a small tug. He glanced at her through the side mirror. She didn't wave, didn't call out. She just kept walking, her head bowed, her arms holding the baby close. Thomas kept driving another 100 yards before he sighed deeply and pressed his foot on the brake. The truck came to a stop, and for a moment all he could hear was the ticking of the cooling engine and the hum of the wind. He stared ahead, thinking. It wasn't safe for a woman and a baby to be out here in this heat. But he also knew how the world worked. People didn't always trust strangers, especially in the middle of nowhere. He hesitated, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. Then he put the truck in reverse and slowly backed up. As he neared her again, he saw more clearly how tired she looked. Her face was red from the sun, her steps unsteady. The baby was awake now, small hands moving weakly against her shoulder. Thomas rolled down the window. "Ma'am?" he called, his voice gentle. She stopped walking but didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, unsure, her eyes wide and cautious. He gave a small nod, trying to show kindness in his expression. "You okay out here?" he asked. "You need a ride somewhere?" The woman shifted her weight, tightening her hold on the baby. "We're fine," she said softly, though her voice trembled. Thomas could hear the weariness in her tone. He knew what fine sounded like when it wasn't true. "Well," he said slowly, "if you change your mind, I've got cold water in the truck. It's a long walk to town." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sun beat down harder and the baby began to fuss. The woman looked at the road, then at the man in the truck. Something in his eyes, tired but kind, seemed to ease her fear just a little. Finally, she nodded. Thomas opened the passenger door. "Go ahead," he said. "It's cooler inside." She hesitated, then carefully climbed in, holding the baby close. The old seat creaked under her and she let out a quiet sigh of relief as the shade fell over her face. Thomas handed her a bottle of water from the cooler behind his seat. She took it, whispering a soft, "Thank you." "No trouble," he said, starting the engine again. "Town's about 12 miles from here." "You heading that way?" She nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "Thank you." As they drove, the road stretched out before them in silence. Thomas didn't ask too many questions. He could tell she didn't want to talk yet, and he respected that. Every few minutes he glanced her way just to make sure she was okay. The baby had fallen asleep again, his tiny hand resting against her arm. After a while, Thomas broke the silence. "Hot day to be walking," he said softly. The woman managed a faint smile. It was the only choice, she said. Thomas nodded slowly. He didn't push for more. Instead, he focused on the road, his thoughts turning over quietly. There was something about her, a quiet strength, a kind of courage he couldn't quite name. The truck rattled over a bump, and he glanced in the mirror, seeing the empty road stretching endlessly behind them. He didn't know who she was or where she was going, but deep down, he had a feeling that meeting her today wasn't just chance. The world had a strange way of bringing people together when they needed it most. As they neared the curve that led toward his ranch, Thomas found himself thinking, maybe he could offer her a meal just until she figured out where to go. The house had been silent for far too long. Maybe a little bit of company wouldn't hurt. And so, under the wide Texas sky, the old rancher and the weary young mother rode together, two strangers brought together by the same endless road, each carrying a story the other had yet to hear. Neither of them knew it yet, but this quiet drive in the heat of the afternoon would be the beginning of something neither had expected, something simple, human, and kind. The truck moved slowly down the quiet road, its tires crunching over the gravel as the warm afternoon light spread across the fields. Inside, the air was still hot, but it was a soft, bearable warmth compared to the burning road outside. Elena sat quietly in the passenger seat holding her baby close. The little boy had fallen asleep again, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Thomas kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the steering wheel. Every now and then he glanced at her, just quick, careful glances, not to pry but to make sure she was doing all right. She looked tired beyond words, her face pale under the sunburn, her hair sticking to her cheeks. But even through the exhaustion, there was something strong about her, a quiet courage that made him think of people who never gave up, no matter how hard life became. Neither of them spoke much for a while. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was just thoughtful, like both were lost in their own worlds. The hum of the engine filled the space between them. Thomas wanted to ask questions, where she was from, where she was headed. But he didn't. He knew that some stories needed time to come out. So instead he tried to make her feel at ease in the simplest way possible. "You can open that window a little," he said gently. "The breeze feels good this time of day." Elena gave a small nod and turned the handle. The wind rushed in softly, carrying the scent of dry grass and dust. She closed her eyes for a moment and breathed deeply. The feeling of fresh air on her skin brought her a small sense of peace. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas smiled faintly. "No trouble." "You're welcome." After a few more miles, he spoke again. "Town's still a good way off," he said slowly. "But my place is closer. If you'd like, you could rest there for a bit. Got shade, cold water, food too." Elena looked at him with a mixture of surprise and hesitation. Her instinct told her to be careful. She didn't know this man, and the world wasn't always kind to women traveling alone. But something about his tone, steady, gentle, without any push, felt honest. "You don't have to," Thomas added quickly, sensing her doubt. "I just figured you and the little one might use a break before the next stretch." Elena glanced down at her baby. His small face looked peaceful, but she could feel the heat coming off his skin. The idea of stopping even for a little while sounded like a gift. "Just for a short time," she said quietly. Thomas nodded. "That's fine." They turned off the main road onto a narrow dirt path that led toward the ranch. The land opened wide on both sides, dotted with old fences and grazing cattle in the distance. The house appeared soon after, a simple, weathered home with a porch shaded by an old oak tree. Beside it stood a faded red barn and a rusted windmill that creaked softly in the wind. As they pulled up, Thomas parked the truck near the porch. He turned off the engine, and for a moment the world seemed completely still. Elena looked around. The place was quiet but not empty. It had the kind of stillness that carried stories, years of hard work, laughter, and maybe a bit of loneliness too. "Go ahead and come inside," Thomas said, opening his door. "You can sit and rest. I'll get you some water." Elena hesitated, then stepped out, adjusting the baby gently against her shoulder. The porch boards felt cool under her tired feet, a relief after miles of burning road. Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. The furniture was simple but clean. A worn sofa, a sturdy table, and a few pictures on the wall. One caught her eye. A smiling woman holding a basket of flowers, her arm around a much younger version of Thomas. "That's my wife," Thomas said quietly when he noticed her looking. Mary. She passed a few years back. Elena lowered her eyes respectfully. She looks kind, she said softly. She was, Thomas replied with a gentle smile. Kindest soul I ever met. He handed her a glass of cold water. She took it carefully, her hands trembling slightly from fatigue. The first sip was like magic, the cool liquid washing away the dryness in her throat. Thank you, she said again. Thomas nodded. You're welcome. There's more if you want it. She sat down at the table, rocking her baby gently. For the first time in days, she felt her body begin to relax. The shade, the water, and the quiet comfort of the room felt almost unreal. After a while, Thomas set a small plate of bread and fruit on the table. Not much, he said, but it's something. Elena looked at the food, her eyes filling with quiet gratitude. It's perfect, she whispered. The baby stirred and she began feeding him. Thomas watched quietly, his heart tightening in a way he didn't expect. It had been years since anyone else had sat at that table. Seeing the young mother caring for her child brought a gentle warmth to the old house again, something he hadn't felt in a long time. When the baby finished and fell asleep, Elena leaned back in her chair. She looked around the room, her fingers tracing the rim of the glass. For the first time since leaving home, she felt safe enough to speak. I didn't mean to trouble you, she said softly. I just needed to get somewhere better, somewhere peaceful. Thomas shook his head. You're not trouble. Everyone needs a little help now and then. She looked at him then, really looked. His face was weathered by years under the sun, his eyes kind but distant, like a man who had learned to carry his pain quietly. You live here alone? She asked. He nodded. Just me and a few cows. My kids are grown now. Got their own lives. Elena smiled faintly. It's a beautiful place. Thank you, he said, his voice gentle. It's quiet, but it's home. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the ticking of the old clock on the wall. The light streaming through the window turned golden as the sun began to sink lower. Thomas cleared his throat. You can stay here tonight if you'd like, he said. The guest room's got a bed. It's not fancy, but it's clean. Elena looked startled. Oh, I couldn't. You've already done so much. He lifted a hand slightly as if to stop her. You don't owe me anything, just rest. Tomorrow, if you still want to head to town, I'll take you there myself. Her eyes softened. That's very kind of you. Thomas gave a small smile. Mary always said kindness doesn't cost a thing. Guess she was right. The room grew quiet again, filled with the soft hum of the evening breeze. Outside, the sky was beginning to change colors, orange, pink, and gold melting into one another like a painting. Elena walked to the window holding her baby. The fields outside seemed endless, glowing in the last light of day. For a moment, she forgot her worries. She felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Behind her, Thomas sat at the table looking at the photo of his wife again. For the first time in years, the silence in the house didn't feel heavy. It felt alive. He glanced toward the young woman and her child. Something inside him, something quiet but deep, told him that maybe this meeting wasn't by chance. Maybe, just maybe, life was giving both of them another chance at something good. As the sky darkened, Thomas stood up and lit the lamp. You'll be safe here tonight, he said. If you need anything, just call out. I'll be around. Elena turned to him, her eyes shining faintly in the lamplight. Thank you, she said again, her voice full of sincerity. He nodded, tipping his old hat slightly out of habit. You're welcome, ma'am. Later that night, as Thomas sat on the porch watching the stars, he thought about the strange way life worked. 1 minute you were alone, thinking the world had forgotten you. The next, a stranger walked into your life and reminded you that kindness still mattered. Inside, Elena rocked her baby to sleep in the quiet room. The wind outside whispered softly through the trees, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt safe enough to dream. And though neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring, both understood one thing clearly. Sometimes, the smallest act of compassion could change the course of two lives forever. Morning sunlight poured softly through the thin curtains, filling the small guest room with a golden glow. Elena stirred slowly, opening her eyes to the sound of birds singing outside the window. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. The air smelled faintly of hay, coffee, and warm bread, so different from the dusty roads she had walked for days. Then it came back to her. The man, the ranch, the kindness she hadn't expected. Her baby slept peacefully beside her, wrapped in the soft blanket Thomas had found the night before. She watched him for a while, his small hands curled near his face, his lips moving in a dream. The sight brought a smile to her tired face. For the first time in what felt like forever, she had slept without fear. She sat up and looked around the room. It was simple but clean. White walls, a small wooden dresser, a chair by the window, and a handmade quilt that smelled faintly of lavender. Someone had taken care of this space once long ago, and that gentle care still lingered. After freshening up, she stepped out into the hallway. The floor creaked under her bare feet, and the smell of coffee grew stronger. From the kitchen came the sound of clinking dishes and the quiet hum of a man who wasn't used to company, but didn't seem to mind it this morning. Thomas looked up when she appeared. "Morning," he said with a small nod. "Hope you slept all right." Elena smiled shyly. "I did, thank you. It's been a long time since I slept that well." He gestured toward the table where a pot of coffee and a few slices of toast waited. "There's breakfast if you want it." "Not much, but it's something warm." She sat down, still a bit unsure, but the smell of the food comforted her. The coffee was strong and a little bitter, but it felt good going down. She glanced around the room again. Photos, a clock ticking softly, a vase with wildflowers that looked freshly picked. "Did you pick those?" she asked, pointing to the flowers. Thomas turned slightly, following her gaze. "Yeah," he said. "Used to be Mary's favorite. She liked bright colors." Elena smiled faintly. "She must have been a wonderful woman." "She was," Thomas said quietly, his eyes softening. "She liked helping people. Never could turn anyone away." There was a pause, comfortable, not heavy. Both knew what it was like to lose something precious. After breakfast, Thomas walked outside to tend to his animals. Elena followed, holding her baby. The air was cool and crisp, and the wide sky stretched endlessly above them. Chickens clucked near the barn, and a few cows grazed lazily in the pasture. The ranch was alive with quiet, steady movement, the kind of peace that came from simple living. "Would you like to see the horses?" Thomas asked. Elena nodded, curious. They walked together to the small stable behind the barn. Inside, the smell of hay and leather filled the air. Two horses stood in their stalls, calm and curious. One, a golden-brown mare, lifted her head and snorted softly as they approached. "She's beautiful," Elena whispered. Thomas smiled proudly. "That's Daisy. Had her for 12 years now. She's gentle, likes people." He reached into his pocket and handed Elena a small piece of carrot. "Go on," he said. "She won't bite." Elena hesitated, but then stepped forward slowly. The horse lowered her head and Elena held out her hand. Daisy's warm breath brushed against her skin before she carefully took the carrot. Elena laughed softly, her eyes lighting up with joy she hadn't felt in a long time. Thomas watched, quietly smiling. It had been years since laughter had echoed through his barn. For the rest of the morning they worked side by side. Thomas fixed a loose fence post and Elena helped feed the chickens. She balanced her baby in one arm and scattered seeds with the other, smiling at how the hens followed her feet eagerly. "You've got a natural touch," Thomas said, leaning on a shovel. "I used to help my mother with her garden," she replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "She said plants can feel kindness. Maybe animals can too," Thomas nodded. "I believe that." As the sun climbed higher, they took a break under the shade of the big oak tree. The baby slept nearby in his blanket, and the breeze rustled through the leaves above them. It was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that spoke of peace, not loneliness. Thomas took a sip of water from his flask and handed it to her. "You know," he said slowly, "when I first saw you walking on that road, I almost didn't stop." Elena looked at him, curious. "Why?" he shrugged, thoughtful. "Guess I was just used to being alone. Didn't think I had anything left to give anyone." He smiled faintly. "But I'm glad I did." Elena looked down at her hands. "I didn't know if I should get in your truck," she admitted. "I was scared. But something about you felt safe." Thomas nodded slowly. "I'm glad you trusted me." They both sat quietly for a while, listening to the gentle sounds of the ranch, the chirping crickets, the soft lowing of cattle, the rhythmic creak of the windmill turning in the distance. As the day went on, Thomas showed her around the property. He taught her how to pump water from the old well and how to tell when the hens were ready to lay eggs. Elena listened closely, smiling now and then, her eyes bright with quiet interest. By evening, when the sky turned orange and purple, Thomas brought out a small wooden cradle he had kept in the attic. Mary used to keep this for visiting families, he said. Thought your little one might rest easier in it. Elena ran her hand over the smooth wood, tears glimmering in her eyes. It's beautiful, she whispered. I don't know how to thank you. Thomas shook his head. You don't have to. Just seeing that boy sleep peacefully again is thanks enough. That night, as she tucked her baby into the cradle, Elena looked out the window. The stars were bright, scattered across the deep blue sky. The air smelled like hay and wildflowers, and for the first time in years her heart felt still. Down the hall, Thomas sat in his armchair by the fire, reading an old book he hadn't touched in a long time. But he wasn't really reading. His thoughts kept drifting to the young woman sleeping in the guest room, the stranger who had brought life back into his quiet house. He thought about how she had smiled at the horses, how gently she had held her baby, and how her laughter had filled the air. There was something healing about her presence. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in a quiet, honest one. The days that followed settled into a soft rhythm. Elena helped with small chores around the ranch, washing dishes, folding laundry, and tending the small garden out back. In return, Thomas made sure she and the baby had everything they needed. Sometimes they talked about simple things like the weather or the animals. Other times they sat in silence watching the sunset together, and slowly, without either of them meaning to, the empty spaces in their hearts began to fill. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and pink, Thomas turned to her and said quietly, You know, this house hasn't felt like home in a long time, but now, it does again. Elena looked at him, her eyes warm. Maybe it was waiting, she said softly, for someone to bring the light back. He smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached his eyes. And as night fell over the quiet ranch, both of them, one who had lost and one who had fled, found a strange kind of comfort in each other's company. Not because they were trying to fill a void, but because kindness had a way of connecting souls that were never meant to walk alone. Neither of them spoke of the future that night. They didn't need to. For now it was enough to simply sit under the wide sky, listening to the soft breathing of the baby inside, and know that in this small corner of the world, hope had quietly returned. The morning light came softly across the plains, painting the grass with a golden glow. Dew sparkled on the leaves like tiny diamonds. The ranch was quiet except for the soft clucking of hens and the distant sound of the windmill turning lazily in the breeze. Inside the little house, Elena stood by the window, holding her baby and watching the sunrise. It had been nearly 2 months since she had arrived at Thomas Grady's ranch. What began as a single act of kindness had turned into something far deeper, a small season of peace in both their lives. But now, as the sun climbed higher, Elena knew it was time to move forward. She looked around the small room that had become her home for those weeks. The quilt on the bed, the rocking chair near the window, and the little wooden cradle where her baby slept peacefully. Everything here carried a piece of comfort she hadn't felt in a long time. Yet she also knew she couldn't stay forever. Thomas had helped her get in touch with a local church group in town that supported young mothers. They had found her a small job at a community center and a place to stay. Nothing fancy, just a room above a bakery owned by a kind couple. It wasn't much, but it was hers. When she stepped into the kitchen, Thomas was already there pouring coffee into 2 mugs. The smell filled the air, familiar and warm. "Morning," he said with his usual quiet smile. "Morning," she replied softly. He handed her a cup. "You're leaving today, aren't you?" She nodded. "The people from the church are expecting me before noon. They're helping me get settled." He looked down into his coffee for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That's good. You deserve a fresh start." Elena smiled faintly. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done, Thomas. You didn't even know me, and yet you gave me food, shelter, kindness. I'll never forget it." Thomas shook his head gently. "You don't owe me thanks, Elena. You brought something back to this place that I thought I'd lost, peace." The house felt alive again. They both sat quietly for a few minutes. The baby babbled softly in his cradle nearby, reaching toward the sunlight that streamed through the window. "I used to think my life was finished," Thomas said after a while. "After Mary passed, the days all blurred together. I just worked, ate, and slept. But when you showed up on that road, I don't know, it felt like the world was giving me a reason to care again." Elena's eyes softened. "Sometimes life sends us the people we need, even when we don't know we need them. Thomas smiled at that. Mary used to say something like that too. After breakfast, Elena packed her small bag. There wasn't much to take. A few clothes, a baby blanket, and the little photograph she always carried. Thomas had quietly placed a small envelope on the table. "What's this?" she asked. "Just a little something to help you get started," he said, almost shyly. "It's not much, but it might buy some groceries or baby things." Elena hesitated, shaking her head. "I can't take this, Thomas." "Yes, you can," he replied firmly, though his voice was still kind. "It's not charity. Think of it as a friend helping another friend." She looked at him for a long moment before finally taking the envelope with a quiet, heartfelt, "Thank you." Outside, the day had grown bright. The truck stood ready by the porch, its paint faded but reliable as ever. Thomas helped her load the small bag into the back. The air smelled like sunshine and cut grass, and the world seemed almost too beautiful to leave behind. Before getting into the truck, Elena turned to look at the ranch one more time. She memorized every detail. The worn barn doors, the patch of wildflowers near the fence, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. It wasn't just a place anymore. It had become part of her story. The drive to town was quiet but peaceful. The baby slept most of the way, and Thomas hummed softly under his breath, an old tune he used to sing long ago. Every now and then, Elena glanced out the window at the wide fields and thought about how far she had come. Not just in miles, but in strength. When they reached the edge of town, she could see the small church with white walls and a steeple that caught the sunlight. A woman stood waiting outside, the pastor's wife holding a kind smile. Thomas parked the truck and turned off the engine. The silence between them felt heavy but gentle, like the moment before a farewell you didn't want to end. Elena turned to him. "You've been more than kind, Thomas. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." He smiled softly. "Just live well. That's all the thanks I need." She felt her throat tighten. "I'll write if that's all right." "I'd like that," he said, nodding. "And if you ever need anything, anything at all, you know where to find me." She reached out and touched his hand. "You've changed my life," she said. "I mean that." Thomas looked into her eyes, the lines on his face softening. "And you've changed mine," he replied quietly. "You reminded me that kindness still has a place in this world." She smiled through the emotion rising in her chest. "Goodbye, Thomas. Goodbye, Elena." He watched as she stepped out of the truck, her baby in her arms. The pastor's wife greeted her warmly, taking her bag and showing her the way inside. Thomas sat there for a long moment, watching until they disappeared through the church doors. Then, slowly, he started the engine and drove away. The road stretched long and empty ahead, the same road where he had found her that burning afternoon. But it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like it carried meaning now. The memory of a woman and her baby who had walked barefoot under the sun and changed the course of his quiet life. Back at the ranch, Thomas parked the truck and sat on the porch. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. It was peaceful. It was full of memory. The sound of her laughter near the barn, the baby's tiny cries in the night, the soft hum of her singing in the kitchen. He picked up the coffee cup she had used that morning and smiled faintly. There was still a trace of warmth in it. Over the next few weeks, letters began to arrive from town. Short notes at first, simple messages written in careful handwriting. "The baby is growing fast. The bakery couple are kind. I found a small job helping with the children at the community center." Thomas kept each letter neatly folded in a drawer beside his chair. Every time one came, it felt like a ray of light breaking through the quiet. He always wrote back, short replies but full of encouragement and care. Months passed. Seasons began to change. The leaves turned golden, then brown, then fell softly to the ground. One cool autumn morning, Thomas stood by the gate of his ranch, watching the road again. In the distance, a small car approached. When it stopped, he saw a familiar face step out. Elena waved, her smile bright and full of warmth. The baby, now bigger with curious eyes, giggled in her arms. "I told you I'd visit," she said with a laugh. Thomas chuckled softly. "And I kept hoping you would." They walked together toward the house, and for a while it was as if time had folded back on itself. The ranch, once a place of silence, was alive again with laughter, footsteps, and the soft, innocent sound of a child discovering the world. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Thomas sat on the porch once more. Elena sat nearby, her baby playing at her feet. The light turned the sky shades of orange and pink, and the air was cool and calm. "Funny thing," Thomas said quietly, watching the horizon. "You showed up that day when I least expected anyone. I thought I was helping you, but turns out you helped me." Elena smiled softly. Maybe we were both meant to help each other. He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the fading light. "Maybe so." The baby let out a small laugh, chasing after a falling leaf that danced in the wind. Both of them watched, smiling, and as the sun sank below the fields, the world seemed perfectly still, not lonely, not broken, but full of quiet, gentle hope. Because sometimes, the smallest moments, a ride offered on a hot road, a shared meal, a simple act of kindness, can change two lives forever. And though the road would go on, winding through miles of earth and sky, a piece of their stories would always remain here, on this little ranch, where a lonely man once stopped his truck and changed a mother's world.